The chilling discovery in Dallas. It was a bitterly cold night in early March 1991. Overhead, the Dallas sky was an endless stretch of darkness, occasionally interrupted by the flicker of a distant street lamp sputtering against the wind. On the outskirts of the city's south side, a narrow service road snaked its way past an industrial area. It was the kind of place people generally avoided, a desolate stretch of cracked asphalt littered with beer cans and cigarette butts. Around 11:40 p.m., a local truck driver named Hank Rogers pulled over to relieve himself before a long haul to Houston. He cracked open his cab door, muttering about the bitter cold, and stepped onto the dirt shoulder. As he adjusted his cap, something caught his eye. In the dim overhead light from the nearby warehouse lot, a stain darker than the surrounding dirt painted an unusual shape along the roadside. It wasn't mud. It was too viscous, too deliberate. Blood. His boots crunched as he edged closer to the odd smear that led toward a nearby patch of scrubby grass. His stomach churned as the metallic odor hit his nostrils. "What the hell?" he mumbled, following the trail. It wasn't long before he found her. The sight was grotesque. A young woman lay sprawled on her back near the base of a chain-link fence, her lifeless eyes staring into the void. Her dark hair was matted with blood, sprawled wildly around her like a grim halo. The tattered remains of her blouse hung open, barely concealing where her chest should have been. But the worst detail, the one Hank wouldn't be able to shake no matter how many bottles of bourbon he drank later that week, was her torso. Where her breasts had once been was now mangled, surgically removed as if someone had taken their time carving with horrifying precision. "Jesus Christ!" Hank gasped, stumbling backward, dropping his flashlight. The flickering beam illuminated the eerie detail of what appeared to be a long, filmy brown hair catching onto the remnants of her shirt. It wasn't hers. Her hair was dark. Shaking, Hank scrambled back to his truck and fumbled for his radio. The dispatcher's voice was calm and detached at first, a sharp contrast to his breathless panic. "Hank, you're breaking up. Say again?" "There's a body! A woman! She's been... Christ, there's blood everywhere! Call the cops! God damn it now!" Hank yelled, gripping the mic with trembling hands. 15 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a Dallas PD cruiser cut through the darkness. The first officers on the scene, Shirley Franks and Marcus Pedersen, pulled up cautiously, the silence of their approach broken only by the crackle of their radio. A portable spotlight illuminated the body. Shirley, a seasoned patrol officer, bent down, struggling to suppress the bile rising in her throat. "This wasn't random," Shirley muttered, her voice tight. "This was personal, or ritualistic." Meanwhile, Marcus swept the area with his flashlight, noting the trail of blood leading back toward the service road and a few flattened bushes nearby. "Footprints here," he noted, squatting for a better look. "Looks like whoever did this wasn't in much of a hurry. See the calm stride? Like they walked away easy." Before long, crime scene tape cordoned off the area, and an air of grim efficiency descended on the night. Detectives in trench coats emerged from unmarked cars, their faces painted with exhaustion and curiosity. Detective Ray Sanders, a grizzled veteran of the force known for his unflinching approach to murder scenes, crouched near the body. "What the hell kind of sick bastard does this?" he asked no one in particular, chewing absently on the end of an unlit cigar. His partner, a younger detective named Kate Monroe, snapped photos from every angle, her camera flashing like lightning in the eerie quiet. It didn't take long for the rumors to start among the officers on site. "Serial killer," someone muttered. "Some psycho weirdo into I don't even know what. Think it's a copycat like that guy in Milwaukee last year?" someone whispered, referencing Jeffrey Dahmer. "Hey Ray," Kate called out, carefully donning gloves as she reached for something near the body. "Check this out." She held up one of the long brown hairs tangled in what remained of the victim's blouse. "This isn't hers, it's animal fur, probably from a goat or something." Ray's brow furrowed deeply. "Goat? What, like some backwoods voodoo shit?" Kate shrugged, bagging the evidence. "Whoever left this is making a statement, whatever it means. It's creepy as hell." The scene wrapped up hours later as the medical examiner zipped up the body bag and the officers loaded it into the coroner's van. By the time sunrise tinted the Dallas skyline with hues of pink and orange, the word had already spread through the precinct. They were dealing with a sick son of a bitch, one who had just started their reign of terror. The city of Dallas would never sleep quite as soundly again. Fear spreading across the city. By the time the sun climbed over the horizon on the following Monday morning, Dallas was already gripping tighter onto its collective sense of unease. News of the grisly discovery spread like wildfire, thanks to both the local TV networks and the early editions of the city's papers. The details printed in bold type across the front pages were sparse but ominous. Body of woman found mutilated on Dallas outskirts, possible serial killer. Even before the police could hold a press conference, cries of speculation and fear had begun to ripple across the community. By Wednesday, fear turned to panic as another body was found. This time, the mutilated remains of a young woman were discovered by an early morning jogger in an overgrown corner of East Dallas's Fair Oaks Park. Local police arrived to find the victim displayed with a deliberate kind of malice, her chest once again the focal point of the horror. Word quickly spread that the same eerie calling card was found, those strange brownish animal hairs clinging to the victim's tattered clothing. For the residents of Dallas, the news struck closer to home than any headline in recent memory. Fear melted into everyday conversation at every coffee shop counter and kitchen table. Local radio shows pivoted topics, hosting experts on criminal psychology to opine about the grave danger of an emerging maniac. The hold music for popular AM stations frequently interrupted for breaking developments, keeping the public on edge. "It's not safe anymore," said Jane McAllister, a mother of two, as she walked her kids to school on Thursday morning. Usually buzzing with children playing and parents chit-chatting, the block was now eerily quiet. Jane tucked the children in closer. "We're staying in after dark and that's final. I'm not letting anything happen to my babies." At the local diner on Greenville Avenue, the conversations took a darker tone. "You hear about that body in the park? The newspaper says the poor thing was gutted like prey," muttered an older man at the counter, his hand gripping his coffee cup so hard it rattled against the saucer. He gestured toward a younger man seated beside him. "You've got to get your girlfriend a taser, maybe a knife too." The younger man furrowed his brows. "I told her no jogging at night, not anymore, not till they catch this, whatever he is." Police Chief Earl Carter held a press conference on Thursday afternoon, flanked by a visibly uneasy Mayor Benjamin Russo and several ranking detectives. The clamor of local reporters echoed in the municipal building as Carter stepped to the podium, adjusting his tie under the glare of bright white lights and rolling cameras. "I know this is a harrowing time for our community," Carter began, gripping the sides of the podium tightly. "The Dallas Police Department wants the public to know that we are pooling every resource to bring this individual, or individuals, to justice. We are working closely with the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit, and no stone will be left unturned." If Chief Carter hoped his words would calm nerves, they did quite the opposite. His hesitation to provide specifics and his firm avoidance of the term serial killer only stoked the speculative frenzy. The media ran wild with it. "What aren't they telling us?" was the headline across the evening news. Gun shops in the city saw a sudden spike in foot traffic by Friday afternoon, with store owners often running out of personal defense items like pepper spray and stun guns. Marquee text crawled across local TV commercials advertising home security systems, boasting slogans like, "Protect your family, we live in dangerous times." Everyone seemed to agree. The city held its collective breath, waiting for something worse. Then it came. Late Sunday evening, on a lonely residential street in Dallas's Lakewood neighborhood, the discovery of a third body sent people into true terror. Just as before, the victim was mutilated in a similar fashion, the ghastly removal of her chest a signature that caused seasoned officers to visibly pale. Parents stopped letting their kids ride their bikes after dinner, young women walked in groups whenever they could. Abandoned footsteps on a lonely street or the flicker of a shadow in the corner of someone's vision became enough to send chills down spines. At local churches, prayer groups sprang up seemingly out of nowhere, congregants clutching hands and whispering fervently to their gods for protection. Pastor Ron Archer of the Friendship Baptist Church spoke to his congregation. "We cannot let fear rule our lives," he declared from the pulpit. But even he cast a nervous glance at the pacemaker clock above the church doors as the sun set. FBI Special Agent Margaret Keegan, sent to help coordinate the case, watched the dark suburban city roll by as she sat in the back of an unmarked car late that Sunday night. "It's a powder keg waiting to blow," she said to Detective Ray Sanders, who steered the wheel while fidgeting with an unlit cigarette between his lips. "You're telling me," Ray replied, eyes scanning the empty streets. "People are outright terrified. Hell, my wife won't even let our cat go outdoors after sunset." He half chuckled, though there was no real humor in it. "And that press conference? Earl didn't even scratch the surface. They should hear what we know." Margaret said nothing for a moment, her attention drifting out the window. The city felt both familiar and foreign. Behind the shiny sheen of fast food signs and gleaming suburban driveways loomed an invisible predator who seemed impossible to anticipate. growls in the dark, like something you'd read to spook yourself in urban legend books. Now it was real, and it lived here in Dallas. Meanwhile, hours deep into the night, cops patrolled anxious neighborhoods far more than usual. Block associations hurriedly fashioned lists of men willing to keep watch at particularly shadowy corners for the week's preparation ahead, and at the back of the police precinct in the dim glow of fluorescent task room wiring, the evidence board pinned to its cork frame told no lies. The bleak pattern of mutilations laid itself neatly among clipped photos and trajectory dots. "We know what we're looking at," Keegan repeated aloud, this time sprouting no denial. "The crime scene, and the strange clues." By the time detectives arrived at the first crime scene on the outskirts of Dallas's south side, the place had become a carefully orchestrated symphony of chaos. Officers barked orders, flashlights cut through the icy night air, and the faint hum of walkie-talkies crackled with instructions. The body of the young woman, sprawled under the cold glow of portable spotlights, was haunting. Every step the investigators took toward the scene revealed intricate and horrifying details, a grotesque tapestry woven in blood. The most immediate and chilling thing detectives noticed was the deliberate precision in the mutilations. It wasn't random, careless violence, it was methodical, as if the killer had scrawled their sinister intentions onto the flesh of their victim with a practiced hand. Detective Kate Monroe crouched carefully in the slightly damp weeds beside the body. She was meticulous, her gloved hands brushing aside strands of the victim's dark hair to examine the wounds hidden underneath. "This is surgical," she murmured, her voice barely carrying over the light breeze and occasional murmur of her colleagues. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Her partner, Ray Sanders, a man hardened by decades of homicide cases, chewed on his ever-present unlit cigar. He knelt a few feet away, staring grimly at the trail of blood leading away from the corpse, his pen scratching sullen notes on his leather-bound notepad. "It's the kind of scene that sticks with you, isn't it? Hell, I can already see this one keeping me up tonight." Nearby, a forensics officer waved them over. "Got something unusual over here," the officer called out, crouching near a thin, twisted line of stains on the gravel road leading to the body. "What is it?" Ray asked, dragging his heavy frame across the terrain to examine the find. The officer pointed to a faint smear embedded in the otherwise cold, dry dust. "Starts here. Almost looks like something was dragged." Kate, joining him, squinted as her flashlight trailed along the path. "The victim? But there's hardly any disruption to the surrounding dirt. It's too clean for what I'd expect if they dragged a body this far." Ray shook his head. "You're right. This wasn't the victim being dragged, it's something else, something smaller maybe, or lighter." The first truly baffling discovery of the night came moments later. A young scene tech, clearly not expecting to be the one to find anything important on her first big case, called out nervously, Detectives, can you come look at this?" She was holding something between tweezers. Thin, wispy, and long, almost delicate. It shimmered brownish gold under the beam of her flashlight. "What the hell is that?" Kate asked, leaning in for a closer look. "Hair," the tech replied, "but not human, not even close. I think this might be animal hair." Ray arched an eyebrow, skeptical. "Animal hair? From what? A dog?" The tech shook her head. "Too coarse, too long. I'm no expert on this stuff, biology isn't my thing, but I'm telling you, this isn't local. Maybe something like goat hair, or a similar livestock breed." "Goat hair?" Kate repeated, incredulous. She turned toward Ray with an expression that said loud and clear, "What could that possibly mean?" Ray scratched the back of his head, muttering, "So now we've got a killer with surgical skills, an apparent obsession with mutilation, and now he's got goddamn goat hair clinging to him?" He chuckled darkly. "Sure, why not? That makes sense in this topsy-turvy nightmare." The tech cleared her throat. "There's more. We've been finding small bits of this near the body, caught on her clothes, even in the folds of the exposed flesh on her chest. It's all over," she explained, motioning to the tattered remains of the victim's blouse, where another forensic officer was carefully extracting more of the hairs. Kate's mind was already racing. He left these behind on purpose, he had to. There's no way a killer this careful, this methodical, just accidentally tracked animal hair all over his victim. Ray smirked faintly. "So what? He's leaving us a calling card? This is his thing now?" "Maybe," Kate answered hesitantly. "Or maybe the hairs are from something used during the murder. A tool, clothing, maybe even his gloves, something he can't detach himself from, like his obsession." The theories swirled uncomfortably between them as the medical examiner gently lifted the body into a black nylon bag. The coroner, an unusually grim-faced man named Dr. Morales, glanced back toward the lead detectives. Your unsub has sharp tools, a steady hand, and nerves of steel. That's my preliminary take. He didn't hesitate or mess up. Here is the expanded content for the section, written in an American true crime style, a baffling crime scene, and strange clues. In the pre-dawn hours of another March morning, a hush fell across the secluded industrial stretch in southeast Dallas. Illuminated by the intermittent pulse of police cruiser lights, officers combed the scene where another gruesome murder had just shaken the city. The evidence was scattered yet hauntingly deliberate, suggesting this killer wasn't merely a maniac. They were methodical, purposeful, and deeply unsettling. Detective Ray Sanders crouched at the edge of the scene, the soles of his boots biting into the damp soil. He absently scratched at the day-old stubble on his chin, his eyes locked on the blood-speckled footprint leading toward a crumbling warehouse. "It's like they're taunting us," he muttered aloud. Standing nearby, his partner Kate Monroe studied the chaotic mixture of scuff marks and bloodstains on the ground. "Maybe," she said cautiously, clicking her flashlight on and leaning closer to a cluster of indistinct streaks. "But this doesn't feel rushed. Whoever did this stayed a while. They took their time." Inside the abandoned warehouse, the killer had seemingly left behind a macabre calling card. Another young woman lying lifeless amid discarded machinery and broken wooden pallets. Her face had been turned slightly away, as if shielding itself even after death, and her arms were oddly tucked beneath her torso. The only sound within the cavernous space was the shuffling of officers' boots and the faint click of a crime scene camera. But it wasn't just the victim's injuries or even the chilling removal of her chest that left the investigators reeling. Beneath one of her torn sleeves was a faint, almost delicate strand of hair, light brown, coarse in texture, and clearly not human. "What on God's green earth is that?" asked Officer Pedersen, gingerly plucking the strand with tweezers and holding it up to the light. "Looks like fur," Kate murmured, joining him. Her stomach churned as she reached for an evidence bag. "It's not from her, that's for damn sure." "Hank was right," Sanders added, remembering the truck driver who'd discovered the first body. "He swore he saw something like this on the other girl too." What made the hair strange wasn't just its presence but its symbolism, or lack of it. Clinging to the victim's clothing and lightly sprinkled along the surrounding debris, it gave off the eerie impression that it had been deliberately left behind. For what purpose, though? No one could say, not yet. The warehouse trail. The trail of blood leading back to the road revealed even more peculiar details. Through the shattered fencing around the warehouse perimeter, deep grooves in the dirt suggested the killer had either dragged the victim or something significant before entering the building. The path ended abruptly near a large rusted metal drum whose surface was scratched with an unrecognizable etching. "It looks fresh," Officer Shirley Franks remarked as she shined her flashlight across the strange markings. Some sort of animal clawing, a scratch, or graffiti? No one could be sure. Back inside the crime scene, the team gathered additional samples. Clutched in the victim's bruised fingers was what appeared to be a scrap of fabric, possibly torn from the killer during a struggle. "This might give us something," Kate said hopefully, examining the small piece of polyester. "Yeah, though I'll bet anyone this guy knows what he's doing. He's careful," Sanders interjected, his voice tinged with frustration. "How many scumbags you know leave human trophy pieces but make sure their tracks practically evaporate?" One of the evidence techs handed him another bag with grit-covered hairs from a loading dock column. They matched the ones found on the victim, albeit in greater volume. The FBI weighs in. By the time the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit arrived later that evening, the Dallas PD was spread thin not only from the physical demands of the crime scenes but also the emotional toll. Special Agent Margaret Keegan brought keen eyes and an even keener skepticism onto the floor of the precinct's conference room. "That fur," she began, addressing the officers and one forensic expert assembled before her. "Goat maybe, or it could even be sheep's wool. We'll know for certain once our lab in Quantico runs a full analysis." "What the hell does that mean?" Sanders intershot. He wasn't one for patience or sugar-coated possibilities. "You saying this freak's walking around with farm animals now?" Keegan didn't smile. Instead, she clicked her tablet screen, bringing up photographic evidence from the two recent crime scenes. "If he is, there's intent. The fur wasn't random. It's become part of his methodology. There's a reason he places it where he does, even if we don't understand it yet. Ritualistic killers often use methods that appear nonsensical or even ridiculous at first glance. It's our job to figure out the why." Beside her, Detective Monroe crossed her arms and frowned. "Do we know if this guy's trying to send a message or if he's just unhinged?" Keegan never hesitated. "Why does it have to be one or the other? He can be both." and Dallas has just become his canvas. A community awash in fear. The discovery of fur at the warehouse, combined with the blood trails and chilling precision of the killer's actions, plunged Dallas even further into paranoia. Forensics raced to analyze every detail. Was the hair some sort of link, a tool to mislead perhaps, or an unconscious detail the killer hadn't considered? Each piece of evidence took hours, but the results came in frustratingly slowly. And meanwhile, church groups and town hall meetings drew record sunrise attendances. The media pooled around neighborhoods asking civilians how they'd feel if another child's mother vanishes. The elusive portrait of the killer. The Dallas PD conference room hummed with tension. As crime scene photos and evidence adorned the corkboards, dozens of eyes scanned the morbid collage for a pattern or clue that might hold the key to unraveling their nightmare. Yet amidst the chaos of unanswered questions, one chilling revelation began to crystallize. This killer was no amateur. He was calculating, patient, and disturbingly proficient. "Who the hell are we looking for here?" Detective Ray Sanders growled, rubbing his temples in frustration as he huddled over the table covered with case files. He's not some drunk husband who snaps and kills his wife. He's not some punk kid pulling a robbery turned deadly. This guy knows his craft. Sitting across from him was Special Agent Margaret Keegan from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. She appeared calm, though her piercing blue eyes betrayed her unease. She clasped her hands and rested her chin on them, her thoughts clearly faster than her words. "You're right, Ray," she finally said. "He's deliberate, surgical, but he's also chaotic in a way." "Chaotic? You call this chaos?" Sanders shot back, his voice thick with exhaustion. He jabbed a finger at the photos on the wall. Women's bodies, their torsos mutilated. "Looks to me like everything he's done is by design." Keegan tilted her head thoughtfully. "Yes, but what motivates him? Serial killers like him don't just do this out of boredom. There's a compulsion, a drive, something he's trying to achieve or express." The room went silent. Even the officers tapping at their keyboards paused momentarily, drawn in by the implication of her words, piecing together a profile. Keegan leaned forward and began outlining the profile that was forming in her mind. "This man is intelligent," she started. "Not book-smart necessarily, but tactically intelligent. Look at the precision of his cuts, the way he removes the parts of the body that matter most to him. He's had practice, or at the very least, he's familiar with anatomy. This suggests potential experience in a field like hunting, slaughtering animals, or even rudimentary medical knowledge." She clicked a button on the projector, and images of the long, coarse hairs found on the victims flashed onto the screen. "Then there's this," she continued. "Animal hair, likely goat or sheep according to our initial tests. This tells us that he either works with livestock or has regular access to them. A farmer, a butcher, someone in the leather crafting trade, it's hard to narrow down, but it's a start." Detective Kate Monroe interjected, her arms crossed as she gazed at the hair samples. "You think the animal hair is deliberate, like a mark he's leaving behind, or is it just something he's carrying on his clothes, maybe from his workplace?" Keegan shrugged. "It could be both, but given the control he's exhibited at the crime scenes, I'd lean toward deliberate. Ritualistic killers often leave behind symbolic elements. It's part of the fantasy they're playing out. Whether this is because he identifies with these animals or because he's using them as a distraction, we don't know, yet." "And the victimology?" Sanders asked gruffly. "He's targeting women in their 20s or 30s, dark-haired, good-looking. You think this is just his type?" "Part of it, yes," Keegan confirmed. "But I don't think it's purely about attraction. These women represent something to him, maybe someone he's known, a mother figure, a lover, a person he hated. That's what we need to figure out. What made him choose them? Because make no mistake, these women aren't random. He's stalking them, watching, planning. The moment of the kill is just the culmination of God knows how much time he spends preparing." The past shadows the present. Keegan gestured toward the timeline of murders on the board. "Another thing we need to consider is his escalation. His first victim was found on March 5th, the second just 6 days later, and now we've got a third body less than a week after that. He's speeding up. That's not good. It means he's growing more confident, and more desperate." The room once again fell quiet, as the weight of her words set in. Monroe adjusted her glasses and asked, "What about his history? If he's this meticulous, wouldn't there be some sort of record? A history of violence, animal torture, maybe even minor run-ins with the law?" "Possibly," Keegan replied, nodding. "If he grew up in a rural area where animal cruelty or violence might have gone unnoticed, it could explain why nothing's on his official record. Or if he stayed under the radar, his progression might have been confined to private spaces until now. But make no mistake, someone in his past knows the kind of person he is. Friends, family members, co-workers, they've seen glimpses. Sanders chimed in again, his voice heavy with frustration. It sounds like we're looking for a needle in a haystack, Keegan. What's going to make this guy slip up? What's going to be the crack in his armor? Keegan paused for a moment, considering his question. Everyone makes mistakes, Ray, she said softly. Even him. The more brazen he gets, the more confident he'll feel. And the more confident he feels, the more likely he is to leave behind a clue that can't be ignored. Nightmare fuel, who he might be. As the meeting wound down, Monroe flipped open her notepad and voiced a thought that had been nagging at her since the first murder. What if this isn't just about power or lust? What if there's something deeper, like a message he's trying to send? A revenge fantasy, a vendetta? Keegan nodded in agreement. It's entirely possible. Many killers with surgical precision and ritualistic behaviors want their crimes to speak for them. They may hate the world, or specifically women, and want their actions to be a sort of twisted protest. Figuring out why is what might lead us to his identity. Still, despite the developing profile, the details remained murky. The killer was a shadow, always one step ahead of the investigation. At the back of the room, Chief Earl Carter folded his arms and observed the discussion quietly until he finally broke his silence. Whether he's a butcher, a farmer, or some psychotic recluse, none of that matters to the families of the victims. What they want is for him to be stopped. And that's what we're going to do. No stone unturned, no rest until this bastard is off the streets. The silent predator. Lurking. As the meeting dispersed, Kate Monroe lingered by the evidence board, staring at the faces of the 3 victims who had already been claimed by the killer's bizarre obsession. Young women with lives full of promise, cut short by a monster who remained an enigma. Ray Sanders joined her, his unlit cigar dangling from his lips. "You think we've got enough here to find him?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "It's a start," Monroe replied, her voice tinged with both determination and doubt. Her eyes shifted to the pinned strand of animal fur, glaring at it as if it held the answer to everything. "But this guy, he's good at hiding. He's not just some crazy, he's patient, methodical. That's what scares me the most." Sanders let out a long sigh. "What scares me is that he's out there right now, planning his next one, and we don't know where, when, or who it's going to be." Monroe nodded solemnly. The city of Dallas was trembling in the shadow of a predator who refused to show his face. And as the detectives left for the night, their minds filled with dread for what they might wake up to in the morning. The shrinking timeline. Between murders. As March dragged on, the city of Dallas seemed to plunge deeper into a shadow of relentless fear. Any hope that the killings were an isolated burst of brutality gradually faded as the timeline between the murders grew shorter. What began as a chilling incident every week now appeared to take place every few days, signaling a horrifying escalation. It was during these weeks that the true frenzy began. Radio shock jocks aired theories, talk shows hauled in retired FBI agents and criminologists, and reporters camped outside the Dallas precinct night and day. The narrative was the same. It wasn't a matter of if the killer would strike again, but when and where. For law enforcement, this distinction was an agonizing countdown. A grim pattern emerging. On the morning of March 16th, a young woman named Rachel Allison had plans to visit her family on the north side of Dallas. She never made it. Her mutilated corpse was discovered that evening behind an abandoned auto repair shop off I-30, miles away from where she was last seen. The victim, age 29, was described as an aspiring photographer known for her vibrant personality. She became the 3rd woman in as many weeks to meet a similar horrifying fate. Ray Sanders arrived at the scene, his mood as stormy as the dark clouds hovering above the shop's rusted metal roof. After slipping past the row of squad cars and ducking under the yellow tape, he nodded grimly at the younger detective who had called him. "Same story?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Yeah," the detective said, lowering his voice. "I don't even know how to say this, but he's refining it." "What do you mean, refining it?" Ray arched a brow, stepping closer to the body. The detective swallowed hard, clearly unnerved. "It's surgical, but now there are no signs of hesitation. The cuts, they're evolving. Cleaner, more precise." Bending down to shine his flashlight over the victim, Ray noticed the infamous calling card once again, brown animal hairs lightly clinging to the folds of Rachel's shirt. His jaw clenched as he muttered under his breath. "He's getting good at this. Too good." accelerating the timeline. 6 days later it happened again. A 32-year-old accountant named Laura Bennett was found lifeless under the 5th Street overpass. Her body bore the same nightmarish hallmarks, bruises that told of a violent struggle, surgical mutilation, and of course the faint but unmistakable presence of coarse animal-like fur. This discovery shattered the police department's already fraying nerves. By now the timeline had completely shifted. The killer wasn't waiting a week. It had only been 5 days since Rachel Allison's murder, and now Laura Bennett's death all but confirmed what the behavioral analysts at the FBI feared most. The predator was accelerating, spiraling toward an uncontrollable binge of violence. In the war room at the Dallas Police Precinct, the mood was grim. The corkboards that lined one wall were now completely covered in maps, strings of red yarn, victim profiles, photos, and evidence clusters. Agent Margaret Keegan stood at the center of it all, gesturing with a pen as she led the morning briefing. "Escalation is one of the most dangerous markers of a serial killer," she explained, her voice steady but urgent. "With each kill, he's building momentum. He's more confident, and because of that confidence, he's taking more risks. This could lead to mistakes, but it also means he'll strike again, and soon." Detective Kate Monroe leaned forward in her seat, her brow furrowed as she pointed toward the projected timeline on the screen. "If he went from 6 days between kills to 5, what's next? 4? 3? "It's likely," Keegan admitted. "But what worries me is that the time interval isn't all that's changing. Look at the locations. He's not sticking to the outskirts of Dallas anymore. He's getting bolder, moving closer to populated areas. He's hunting where the risk is higher." A public-on-edge news of the killings dominated Dallas television, radio, and every major newspaper front page. Anchors introduced grim reports with ominous voiceovers like, "The terror gripping Dallas intensifies tonight." One local news outlet even aired an interactive timeline of the murders, allowing viewers to track where and when each killing had occurred. It became a morbid fixation for families glued to their television screens, praying silently that the next victim wouldn't be someone they knew. The killings also had a chilling effect on daily life in Dallas. Street fairs and community events were canceled. Parks that were once packed with joggers at sundown now sat eerily desolate. A surge of young women signed up for martial arts classes, while hardware stores struggled to keep mace and pepper spray in stock. "You don't need to be a genius to figure out what's going on," grumbled a gas station clerk named Joe to a crowd of reporters interviewing locals about the spreading panic. "Anybody with half a brain is staying home after dark. If you're not, you might as well paint a target on your back." For some, the fear was palpable. Tina Garvey, a single mom, described how she now walked her 2 kids to school every morning instead of letting them take the bus on their own. "I don't even feel safe letting them step into the front yard," she said, clutching her youngest to her side. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted, "That maniac is out there somewhere, and until they catch him, we're all just sitting ducks." Building tension. Among the police, tensions were equally high among the detectives working the case. In the endless back and forth between the Dallas PD and the FBI consultants, frustration often boiled over into arguments. "We're running out of time," Kate snapped during one particularly heated strategy meeting. "Every day we waste debating theories is another day this lunatic is out there." "Easy, Monroe," Ray said, trying to calm her, though his own nerves were clearly frayed. "You think we don't feel the same way? None of us are sleeping at night until this bastard is caught, believe me." Margaret Keegan raised a hand, her tone cutting through the rising tension. "Enough. Finger-pointing isn't going to catch him. We need to focus on what we do know. The fur is still our best lead. It's unique, and it's deliberate. We trace it, and we might just find him." "This guy is a ticking time bomb," Monroe muttered, as she stared at the evidence board, "and it feels like we're standing next to the blast radius." The clock is ticking. As the clocks inched closer to midnight on March 22nd, officers patrolling the downtown district reported fever-pitched paranoia among residents. Every shadow was an omen, every echo of footsteps a harbinger of darkness. By now, the timeline between murders was shrinking rapidly, as if the killer could feel the walls closing in. The fear was plain across Dallas. The predator didn't seem to be slowing down. He was accelerating, feeding off the chaos he had instilled. And in the hallowed halls of the precinct, detectives worked relentlessly, knowing deep down that the next victim was only a heartbeat away. The question that haunted them wasn't just when it would happen. It was who. The killer expands his targets. Sunday, March 24, 1991. The air in Dallas carried a tense stillness, marked by darting eyes and jittery conversations. The city's collective fear had become something deeper, paranoia, creeping into the edges of daily life. For weeks, the killer had honed his methods, his bloodlust seemingly focused on a specific type of victim: young, dark-haired women. The pattern was horrific but predictable. But what happened next shattered whatever threads of predictability the police had been clinging to. At exactly 12:17 a.m., a frantic call came through to 911. The voice on the line, trembling and panicked, belonged to a middle-aged security guard who had stumbled upon a grisly sight near an abandoned parking lot on the city's south side. "Jesus Christ, it's bad. There's blood everywhere. I think it's a man. He's dead." 15 minutes later, Detective Ray Sanders and Kate Monroe arrived on the scene, the now familiar red and blue strobe lights flashing across the cracked pavement. They moved quickly, ducking under the yellow crime scene tape. What they found stopped them in their tracks. The victim, a man in his early 40s, lay slumped against a rusted dumpster. His shirt was soaked in blood, the once white fabric now a deep, sticky crimson. Unlike the women before him, his chest had not been mutilated, but his body told its own horrifying story. Bruises and cuts along his arms and knuckles spoke of a violent struggle, the final blow delivered by multiple stab wounds to the abdomen. "Jesus," Ray muttered, kneeling down as he took in the scene. "This isn't the same, but it is, isn't it?" His voice was filled with equal parts disbelief and dread. Kate scanned the area cautiously, her flashlight darting across the alleyway's walls. "It's him, it has to be. Look at this." She crouched, pointing to the victim's shirt. Twisted into the fabric, clinging as if planted intentionally, were those damned coarse brown hairs. Ray sighed heavily. Him again. He stood and rubbed a hand along his jawline. "So, what now? He's just killing whoever the hell he wants?" A shift in behavior. The arrival of a male victim created chaos within the task force. For weeks the killer had stuck to a chillingly consistent pattern, targeting young women, always dark-haired, always alone. There was a ritual to it, something deeply specific. And now, this? What could possibly explain the break in behavior? In the following hours, the precinct war room became a flurry of theories and arguments. Margaret Keegan, the FBI profiler brought in to assist the Dallas team, stood stoically at the head of the room, addressing the crowd of detectives, crime analysts, and officers. "His change in targets isn't random," she began, her voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "Killers like this don't just wake up one day and decide to expand their range out of boredom. There's a reason for this. Something triggered the shift." She gestured toward the board displaying the latest crime scene photos, the man's body a stark contrast to the three women that preceded him. Kate leaned forward in her chair. Could he have been interrupted? Maybe this guy wasn't his intended victim. What if... She paused, searching for the words. What if this man stumbled across him while he was stalking someone else? Keegan nodded. "It's possible. We know he's calculated, meticulous even, but no one's flawless. If this man confronted him or became an obstacle, the killer may have felt the need to remove him." Ray, seated at the far end of the room, let out a low grunt. "So, what are we saying here? He's broadening his scope? Or he's just gonna start killing anyone who gets in his way?" Keegan hesitated for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Both are possibilities, but the most concerning explanation is that this isn't an interruption, it's an evolution. He's escalating in ways we didn't anticipate." A trail of chaos. The murder of a man sent shockwaves through the community. If young women couldn't feel safe before, now the entire city felt like fair game. The killer had broken the unspoken pattern. He was no longer confined by his ritual. Now it appeared anyone could be a target. At a local hardware store, the stock of security items, locks, mace, even heavy-duty flashlights, was wiped clean by midday. Gun shops reported double the usual business with lines stretching down the block. Carla Henderson, a grandmother of 4, clutched a box of pepper spray as she spoke to a local news reporter. "If they don't catch him, I'm not stepping foot outside after dark. Hell, I'm not stepping foot outside at all." Meanwhile, at the Dallas Police Department, morale hit an all-time low. Detectives worked around the clock, combing every known detail for patterns or clues that might explain the killer's sudden shift. Interviews and doubts. Detective Sanders and Kate Monroe visited the family of the male victim, a man named Ronald Pierce. His wife sat at the edge of her couch, clutching a framed photo of him at their wedding. "He wasn't out there causing trouble," she insisted, her voice cracking. "He worked late shifts at the warehouse near there. He was coming home. It's not fair. He didn't even know this monster." Tears streamed down her face as she buried her head in her hands. Kate placed a comforting hand on the widow's shoulder but couldn't form the words to tell her the truth. The cruel reality was that there might not have been a reason, just bad luck. Theories. Mount back at the precinct, Margaret Keegan took another approach. She pinned a new section to the evidence board. Why the change? There could be one of three reasons, she began, addressing the room. First, he made a mistake. Ronald Pierce wasn't intended as a target, but he became one because he got in the way. Second, the killer is expanding. He might feel emboldened, or he's trying to confuse us by breaking his pattern. And third, she trailed off, looking around the room before finishing. The third is the most troubling. He's evolving. This kill could be a new phase, one we don't yet understand. Ray shook his head from the far corner. You're saying what? We should expect more men now? Hell, maybe kids next? He slammed his notebook down on the table, earning tense looks from everyone present. This guy's throwing out the rulebook and we're scrambling to make sense of it. Meanwhile, he's out there planning his next move. The killer's grip tightens. The fear across Dallas was unlike anything the city had seen before. Families barricaded themselves inside their homes, chain locks and deadbolts securing doors that used to remain unlocked. The killer was no longer just a boogeyman for women walking home alone. He was an indiscriminate predator, and his unpredictability was his sharpest weapon. Margaret Keegan stared at the updated evidence board late into the night. The faces of the victims, the maps, the hairs, the patterns, or lack thereof, they all blurred together in her tired mind. But one thing stood out, clear as day in the chaos. The killer had crossed a line, and whatever limits he once respected, he no longer cared about them. Kate approached her from behind, resting a hand on the edge of the table. You think he's done with his games? The high-stakes chase. It began on the evening of March 28, 1991, a quiet Thursday in the suburbs, until it wasn't. Around 7:43 p.m., a woman screamed on the edge of Maplewood Plaza, a mid-tier Dallas shopping district. The echoes of her cries traveled far enough to trigger a frantic call to 911 from a nearby resident. Lisa Garrett, a young teacher in her late 20s, had been walking to her car in the plaza's dimly lit parking lot. She didn't see the man emerge from the shadows until it was too late. With a sudden force, he lunged at her from behind, knocking her purse to the asphalt. She fought back, her nails raking his face, determined to survive, but it didn't feel like a random mugging. He wasn't after her money. His hands wrapped around her throat, squeezing in a way that smelled of sick intent, and then, mercifully, he hesitated. Rustling footsteps approached from an adjacent alley, accompanied by the sharp voice of a delivery driver returning to his truck. "Hey!" the driver shouted, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a lifeline. The attacker snarled, a vicious, guttural sound, before shoving Lisa to the ground and sprinting toward the outskirts of the plaza. She gasped for air, clutching her throat, her voice barely audible over the sound of her pounding heart. He had a knife. The perpetrator escapes. Detective Kate Monroe was already 2 blocks away when the call came in. She'd been canvassing a nearby neighborhood with other officers, following up on a weak lead that hadn't seemed promising, but the urgency in the dispatcher's tone made her body tense. Suspect on foot, southbound near Maplewood Plaza, matching initial descriptions. Man in dark clothing, roughly 5'10", late 30s to early 40s. Knife involved. Repeat, suspect may be injured. Injured? Kate muttered to herself as she shifted into gear, her car screeching out of its parked position. She looked at the officer seated beside her, a rookie named Thomas Gaines who hadn't yet learned the seasoned calmness of chasing shadows. His knuckles were pale from gripping the dashboard. "They said injured, right?" Gaines asked nervously. Kate nodded. "Yeah, makes this all the more dangerous. Desperate animals are the worst kind. The chase begins." The description on the radio painted a partial picture. A man darting through alleys, head down, one hand gripping his waist as he fled into the dimly lit sprawl of Dallas backstreets. Officers circled the neighborhood like a net beginning to close. Ray Sanders got there next. He exited his police cruiser, flashlight in one hand and a Smith & Wesson in the other, straining to catch any noise. Footsteps, rustling leaves, anything to track their target. The radio on his hip crackled with updates from responding units. "North side clear. Suspect may have doubled back toward Elm Street." Ray pressed a button on the radio. "Keep a tight perimeter. Unless this guy's got wings, he'll screw up eventually." But Kate wasn't so sure. As her patrol car swerved onto Maplewood Avenue, her gut twisted. People like this didn't just screw up, they stayed one step ahead until they didn't need to. She stepped out of the car, scanning the edges of the parking lot. A group of officers tended to Lisa Garrett, wrapping her in an emergency blanket as she trembled. Gaines approached the group to gather a description while Kate stayed behind and scanned the pathway where the assailant had disappeared. "You're out there," she whispered to herself. Her flashlight swept across dumpsters and low concrete fences, illuminating nothing but silence. A sighting, a slip. Then, a voice squawked from her radio. "We've got something. Suspect spotted near the industrial park on Briarwood Drive. Officers in pursuit on foot." "Damn it!" Kate ran back to the car, shouting over her shoulder to Gaines. "Get in! Now!" The scene shifted rapidly as she sped down Elm Street, the patrol lights slicing through the evening haze of the Dallas suburbs. Ray's voice buzzed on the line with unshaken authority. "Southwest corner, an old auto shop that's been fenced off. We've got him cornered." "Cornered doesn't mean captured, Ray!" Kate barked into the comm system as she swerved onto the same route. The auto shop's twisted metal gate came into view, with 2 squad cars already stationed outside. Officers moved in formation with flashlights raised, their beams bouncing off rusted equipment and shattered windows. A rookie officer shouted, "He's inside!" before darting toward the building's left wing. Ray's voice rang out angrily, "Wait, don't go in alone!" But it was too late. A loud crash followed, a metal pipe clanging against the concrete floor. By the time Kate made it to the enclosure, chaos had spread like wildfire. The desperate breakout. The killer knew the area better than they did. There was no other explanation for how he slipped past them. A blur of dark clothing darted from a rear exit, shoving over a stack of oil drums to slow the approaching officers. Shouts filled the humid Dallas air as flashlights traced his unpredictable movements. Kate rounded the side of the auto shop, spotting him for the first time. His movements were erratic, one hand gripping his side, as dispatch had said, and a limp that stemmed from what appeared to be an injury. Still, he moved fast. "Freeze!" she shouted, raising her firearm. Ray caught up moments later, panting and already frustrated. "I said freeze! Damn it!" Kate yelled again, her boots striking hard against the pavement as she sprinted after him. But he didn't stop. He moved fast toward an abandoned alley, where he scaled a chain-link fence with surprising agility for a man in such a state. Kate, undeterred, fired a warning shot into the air. It was a calculated risk. Protocol would reprimand her, but right now, less lethal risks felt like a luxury. The shot startled him. His head jerked, losing momentum for a crucial half-second, allowing Ray to gain on him. They collided at the corner of the alleyway, bodies slamming into one another before they tumbled to the ground. "Don't even think about it," Ray growled, pinning one arm while struggling to wrest free the suspect's other hand, which held a knife. "Drop it!" Kate arrived seconds later, using her boot to kick the knife several feet away before snapping cuffs onto his wrists. The man bucked and writhed like a caged animal, snarling through gritted teeth, face to face with a monster. The man, unshaven, middle-aged, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, looked nothing like the vicious killer they'd imagined, but his eyes betrayed everything. They darted everywhere, every visible ounce of nervous energy coiled into them like a spring ready to snap. "You've got a lot to answer for," Kate whispered, her voice venomous. The suspect let out a low chuckle between labored breaths. "You'll wish you hadn't found me." The shocking discovery at the tannery. The breakthrough came on a damp Monday morning, March 31st, 1991, the kind of gray, overcast day that seemed appropriate for how everyone at the Dallas Police Department was feeling. Exhausted detectives shuffled in and out of the precinct, guarded hope fighting against the weight of their mounting frustration. They were no closer to understanding their suspect's motives, or stopping him, until a small but curious thread emerged from the evidence: the hair. For weeks, the coarse brownish animal hairs found on each victim had been a bizarre but consistent calling card of the killer. Despite exhaustive attempts to link the evidence to local farms or ranches, the sample results kept coming up empty. That is, until forensic tech Jill Mendoza walked into the bullpen, holding a clipboard and shaking her head in disbelief. "You're going to want to see this," she said, her voice tinged with an excitement that sharply contrasted with the bleak atmosphere of the room. Kate Monroe, seated with her legs kicked up on her desk in a rare moment of rest, glanced over at Jill from under her glasses. "What have you got?" Jill handed the clipboard to Margaret Keegan, the FBI profiler who had been working closely with the task force. "We ran the sample again through the expanded database. Turns out the hair isn't random goat or sheep hair from a ranch, it's processed." "Processed?" Keegan asked, squinting at the report. "You mean like, treated?" Jill nodded. "Exactly. The hairs were chemically treated and tinted, most likely as part of leather production. Based on further analysis, we were able to narrow it down to specific tannery processes used in smaller-scale leather crafting." "Wait a second," Ray Sanders interjected, straightening up in his chair. "You're saying this isn't farm residue or an accident? This SOB works with leather?" Jill shrugged. "Or moves around it. But yes, the consistent chemical markers mean these hairs were shed during the tanning and processing phase." Keegan's mind was already moving ahead. How many tanneries in the Dallas area could fit that description? "Only one that matches," Jill replied. "Westward Hides, over on the south side of town." The search begins. By noon, a full team of patrol cars and unmarked detective vehicles rolled up to Westward Hides, a modest tannery tucked discreetly between a row of aging warehouses. The building's exterior was unremarkable. Faded red bricks, a sun-bleached sign, and a yard cluttered with old, rusting vats that hadn't been used in years. Kate and Ray stepped out of their cruiser, exchanging a look before heading toward the front entrance. "Smells like a lawsuit waiting to happen," Ray muttered, wrinkling his nose at the pungent, acrid odor seeping out from the building. Inside, the tannery buzzed faintly with the sound of machines and workers moving hides from vat to vat. The air was dense, humid, and reeking of chemicals used to strip and cure animal skins. A wiry man in his 50s wearing a dirty blue jumpsuit and holding a clipboard stepped forward, clearly irritated to see the police. "What's this about?" the man who introduced himself as the operations manager asked gruffly. Kate wasted no time. "We're looking for one of your employees, Martin Blake. Is he here today?" The man frowned, scratching his head. "Blake? Yeah, Blake's been working here for the last year or so. Quiet type, keeps to himself. What's he done?" Ray's response was sharp. "That's what we're here to find out. Where is he?" "Not here," the manager replied. "He called in sick this morning, said he'd probably be out all week. Honestly, I just figured he was sitting at home nursing a bad hangover." Kate's eyes narrowed. "We're going to need access to his workstation, and anyone who's worked shifts with him will need names." The manager sighed but complied. He led the detectives toward a back corner of the tannery, where a single workstation stood cluttered with tools, scraps of leather, and something that made Kate visibly recoil. A stained utility blade that looked like it had been used for far more than just leather work. "What in the hell is that?" Ray muttered, pulling on gloves as he leaned in. The blade was unmistakably sharpened to surgical precision and had faint smears of something dark on its edge. As Kate scrutinized it closer, her stomach churned. She didn't need the lab to confirm that it wasn't just leather. "That's blood," she whispered. The hidden clues. As forensic teams swept through Blake's workstation and locker, disturbing items began to emerge. Among the mundane tools and equipment were surgical instruments that had no place in a tannery, small jars of chemicals that didn't match the company's inventory records, and a crumpled collection of newspaper clippings, each one related to the murders. Keegan flipped through the articles, her expression grim. "This isn't some casual curiosity," she said, holding up one particularly detailed clipping. "He's keeping track of us, cataloging his own crimes." Toward the back of the facility, a trainee officer bumped into something peculiar, a heavily wrapped bundle shoved deep into a storage closet. When unwrapped, it revealed coarse canvas bags filled with hair. Processed, dyed, and disturbingly similar to the samples found on the victims. Ray exhaled sharply. Son of a bitch was stockpiling this. Kate's jaw tightened. This isn't just a job for him. This place was his playground. The tannery manager speaks. Back in the break room, the tannery manager sat with detectives, nervously chewing at the edges of his fingernails. "Listen," he said, voice trembling. "Blake was quiet, but he worked hard, never gave us any issues. Now and then, he'd ask about taking some scraps home, but lots of workers do that for hobby stuff. Nothing unusual." "Did he ever show signs of violence? Anger?" Kate pressed. The manager hesitated. "No, not really. I mean, once, a coworker said Blake got weird after a shift, muttering something about how life's just materials, waiting to be shaped. But he works with hides all day. I just figured he was talking about leather." "That's not all he was talking about," Keegan said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "He wasn't shaping leather, he was shaping his fantasy. The pursuit of Martin Blake." By the time the evidence was fully collected, Martin Blake became the primary suspect in the investigation. Detectives now had more than a vague profile. They had a name, a face, and horrifying evidence linking him to the crimes. But as night fell across Dallas, Blake was nowhere to be found. "Wherever he is," Kate said as she stared grimly out the window of the precinct, "he's watching us. He knows we're closing in." Ray added, "And the bastard isn't going to wait for us to catch him. He's going to strike again before sunrise." The heart-pounding takedown. By late evening on April 2, 1991, the air in Dallas felt almost suffocating. The entire police force was on edge. Martin Blake, now the confirmed suspect in the brutal murders that had plagued the city, was still at large. As the clock ticked into the night, updates poured into the precinct from every possible lead. Patrol cars swarmed known locations, family homes, an ex-girlfriend's address, and scattered abandoned buildings Blake was rumored to frequent, but he was nowhere to be found. Every minute that passed added to the unbearable tension. Ray Sanders stood in the precinct's operations room, the sweat on his brow matched only by his heavy frustration, while Kate Monroe paced irritably by the evidence board. "This guy's a ghost," Ray muttered, slamming his fist on the table. "It's like he knows where we're going to look before we do." Kate stopped pacing for a moment. Her eyes flicked to the pinned articles, the maps, the red string web of connections. "He's not a ghost," she said firmly. Her jaw tightened. "He's arrogant. People like this, they thrive on their own sense of control, but everything about this guy screams compulsive. He can't just vanish. He'll find somewhere he feels safe, somewhere he can keep feeding his sick obsession." Margaret Keegan, seated nearby, glanced at them from over the rim of her coffee cup. She looked dead tired but no less focused. "And those somewheres are always predictable," she interjected. "These guys go back to what they know, what feels familiar. Look at his history, the tannery, the woods." Her voice trailed off, and an idea clicked. Ray raised an eyebrow. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Kate narrowed her eyes. "The abandoned trailer compound on the edge of Cedar Creek? The one he would have passed every day going to the tannery?" Keegan nodded, her expression grim. "Exactly, and if he's desperate enough, he'll be hiding right under our noses." The compound. The old trailer compound had been abandoned for at least a decade, a derelict slice of nowhere just a few miles out from the populated edges of Dallas. The area was overgrown with shrubs and dead trees, and locals avoided it due to rumors of wild animals and squatters. But for Blake it would be perfect. Isolated, concealed, a natural hunting ground. By 11:23 p.m., a convoy of unmarked police cars and several squad SUVs surrounded the area. Officers moved in tight formation, their flashlights cutting into the thick darkness of the compound. The air was unnervingly quiet, save for the crunch of boots against the dry, cracked dirt. Ray stood by the driver's door of his cruiser, speaking into the radio. "Everyone stays sharp. If he's here, he's dangerous. And let's not forget, he's got a toolkit of knives sharper than anything in this city." Kate adjusted her vest straps and checked her firearm. "If he's here, he's not going down without a fight." The first signs. The entry team moved toward one of the larger, dilapidated trailers near the back of the compound. Its windows were shattered, and the aluminum siding was rusted to the point of disintegration. The door hung askew on one hinge as if it hadn't been opened in years. One officer signaled to Kate and Ray. "We've got movement inside," he whispered. Ray nodded, signaling back. "Go quiet. Approach slow." They crept toward the trailer. The beam from Kate's flashlight caught a fleeting shadow, a brief flicker of something moving inside. Her pulse quickened, and for a fraction of a second she thought she heard shuffling, like boots dragging across the floor. "Blake!" Ray shouted, his voice booming against the hollow metal walls. "We know you're in there! Come out with your hands where we can see them!" No answer. Keegan, standing at a distance near the perimeter, keyed her radio. "He won't come out! He knows the game's up! Be ready! This guy won't go quietly!" The standoff. After several seconds of silence, the door to the trailer creaked open slightly. A dim light flickered from within, a makeshift lantern glowing on a table inside. For a moment it looked like Blake might surrender. But then Ray caught sight of it, a glint of silver reflecting in the lantern's light. It was a knife, the blade long and jagged, a grotesque piece of equipment that seemed almost tailored for the atrocities he'd committed. "He's armed!" Ray shouted, raising his firearm. Just as the words left his mouth, the door burst open completely. Blake charged out, his blade in one hand, his other hand gripping what looked like a makeshift club. His face was contorted with rage, eyes wild like an animal cornered. "Police! Drop the weapon!" Kate yelled, her finger tight on the trigger. But Blake wasn't listening. He lunged toward one of the officers closest to the trailer, slashing wildly. A gunshot cracked through the air, then another. Blake staggered but didn't fall. His adrenaline seemed to carry him forward like a machine. The takedown Ray tackled him head-on, both of them crashing to the ground just feet away from the trailer steps. The knife clattered out of Blake's hand, but the struggle didn't stop there. He thrashed and snarled like a rabid dog, one hand reaching desperately toward his fallen weapon. Kate was there in seconds, her knee pressing into his back as she slapped cuffs onto his wrists. "It's over," she hissed through gritted teeth. Blake let out a guttural laugh, his head turning just enough to catch her eye. "You think this ends with me?" he rasped. His voice was low, but it carried an unsettling conviction. "You've got no idea what's coming." For a moment the night seemed to stand still. The chaos of the takedown faded into the background as his words hung in the air, capturing a nightmare. The scene turned chaotic again as officers hauled Blake to his feet. Blood from a bullet graze streaked down his arm, and his face was slick with dirt and sweat. He didn't resist anymore. Instead he smiled, a sick, twisted grin that made Kate's skin crawl. Ray shook his head, waving the others forward to escort him to a waiting squad car. "This guy's a piece of work," he muttered. Keegan stayed back, her arms crossed as she stared at the bloodied knife now bagged as evidence. "He's not finished yet," she said quietly. "He's got something else planned, something we haven't seen." Kate glanced at her. "You think he was working alone?" Keegan didn't answer right away. Her gaze was fixed on the dark windows of the trailer as if they might hold the answers. "I don't know," she admitted, "but there's more to this. That much is clear." Ray leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Then we'd better figure it out before anyone else dies." Unmasking the monster. As Blake was dragged to the cruiser, still grinning like he'd won whatever sick game he was playing, Kate couldn't help but feel uneasy. They had captured him, finally. The killer who had terrorized Dallas for weeks was in custody, but it didn't feel over. Not yet. And judging by the way Blake's laugh echoed in her mind long after the sound of the sirens had faded, she wasn't sure it ever truly would be. Justice is served. The trial of Martin Blake began on June 15, 1991, in a packed Dallas courtroom less than 3 months after his violent capture. The city, still raw with the trauma of his calculated killing spree, held its collective breath as the judicial system moved into motion. This wasn't just a trial. For many, it was a reckoning, a chance to confront the monster who had terrorized their streets. The public's hunger for justice was undeniable. Outside the courthouse, news trucks parked in tight rows, their satellite dishes turned skyward as reporters rehearsed their lines for the evening broadcasts. Spectators gathered in droves, some holding photos of the victims, others demanding swift and severe punishment. "We want the death penalty!" one man shouted into a camera, his face red with fury. "This guy doesn't deserve another breath after what he's done to those women, and that poor man!" Inside the courthouse, the mood was no calmer. The families of the victims sat in dignified silence in the front rows, their faces bearing the weight of unfathomable grief. Kate Monroe and Ray Sanders, the detectives who had chased Blake down, sat a few rows behind them, side by side. They were quiet, reflective. This was the culmination of months, years even, of work. But for both of them, there was no celebration in seeing a monster brought to court. There never was. The prosecution's case assistant district attorney Laura Grayson approached the case with relentless precision. "This trial," she told the jury in her opening statement, "is about cold, calculated evil. Martin Blake is a man who hunted, tortured, and mutilated innocent people. He is not the product of circumstance. He is not the victim here. And I will prove without a shadow of a doubt his responsibility for every horrific act he committed." Over the course of 2 weeks, the prosecution laid out its case in meticulous detail. They began with forensic evidence. Jill Mendoza, the forensic technician who had connected the processed animal hairs found on the victims to the tannery, took the stand and recounted her discovery. "Each sample matched the chemical markers of leather processed at Westward Hides," she explained to the jury. "The findings were consistent across multiple crime scenes." From there, they presented the recovered murder weapon. A blood-stained utility blade, chemically linked not only to substances found at the tannery, but also carrying DNA from 2 of the victims, was displayed for the jury. The most haunting testimony came from Lisa Garrett, the survivor of Blake's final, unsuccessful attack. She took the stand with trembling hands, her voice fragile but unwavering. "I thought I was going to die," Lisa told the court. "He came out of nowhere. There was no emotion in his eyes, nothing, just the kind of emptiness that—" She paused, clutching the railing before whispering, "The kind that doesn't go away." Kate sat in the gallery, her fists tightening as she listened. The lines between her professional detachment and personal rage blurred as Lisa described the suffocating grip around her throat and the terror of seeing the glint of his knife. "What made him stop?" the defense attorney asked, trying to poke holes. "A delivery driver. He heard me scream," Lisa replied, lifting her chin. "That's the only reason I'm alive right now." The defense's attempt. The defense team, led by court-appointed attorney Robert Hayes, had little to work with. The evidence against Blake was airtight. His DNA was everywhere. It was found on his victims, in his workstation, and in their blood on the knife. His history, pieced together during the investigation, revealed someone with clear patterns of escalating violence. Still, Hayes tried to build a case around Blake's mental state, arguing that his client lacked the capacity to understand his actions during the killings. Martin Blake's childhood was one of unimaginable abuse, Hayes said sympathetically during opening remarks. This case is not about excusing his actions but understanding how a human being can become so broken. The jury wasn't buying it, nor was the prosecution. Grayson's rebuttal was sharp and unwavering. Martin Blake may have suffered in his youth, but plenty of people endure tragic childhoods without becoming a serial killer. His methodical planning, his surgical precision, proves he knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps the most damning moment came when Blake's journals, recovered from his home, were introduced as evidence. The pages dripped with disturbing, detailed accounts of his murders, written as if he were narrating the plot of a sick fantasy novel. "They couldn't cry once it was done," one passage read. "The silence after is the part I love the most." The jury audibly recoiled as the prosecutor read the passage aloud. The faces of justice. On the final day of the trial, closing arguments began. The courtroom was silent save for the sound of pens scribbling and the occasional rustling of paper. Grayson walked forward, standing just feet from the jury box, and spoke with the kind of conviction that makes your skin crawl. "You've seen the evidence," she said, gesturing toward the table where photos of the victims and crime scene evidence were splayed out. "You've heard the testimony. Martin Blake didn't just kill these people, he saw them as objects, as materials for his twisted pleasure. If we allow ourselves a single shred of doubt, if we hesitate for one moment, then we fail those victims, we fail this community, and we leave the door open for more monsters like him." The defense lawyer's closing lacked fire. Even Hayes seemed resigned to the inevitable by the time he finished. As the jury left to deliberate, a heavy stillness settled over the room. Kate turned to Ray and whispered, "How long do you think they'll take?" Ray glanced at her, his face worn but steady. "Not long." He was right. The sentence. After just 4 hours, the jury returned a unanimous decision. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Some wept. Others clutched one another and cheered quietly. When asked if he had any final words before his sentencing, Martin Blake, shackled at both hands and feet, looked at the judge and smiled. "You'll never understand me," he said cryptically. "You think it's over, but it's not." The judge didn't flinch. "Martin Blake, you've been convicted of first-degree murder and a series of heinous crimes that forever shattered this community. I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection. May the families of your victims find some solace in knowing you will never walk free again." Aftermath. As Blake was led out of the courtroom, Kate and Ray stood silently in the back of the room. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of everything they'd witnessed, everything they'd endured, hung between them like a storm cloud. Outside, Lisa Garrett found her way to Kate as reporters swarmed around. "Thank you," Lisa said, her voice soft but sure, "for stopping him, for making sure he couldn't hurt anyone else." Kate nodded but said nothing. That night, back at the precinct, Kate sat alone in the bullpen staring at the evidence board. The case was over. Blake was headed to death row, but the faces of his victims, the photos pinned up on that board, refused to let her go. "Another one down," Ray said as he walked in, setting a cold coffee on her desk. "Yeah," Kate replied, her eyes still fixed on the board. "But it never feels like enough, does it?" Ray sighed and sat beside her. "We did what we could. For them, that's all we'll ever be able to do, Kate." Kate finally leaned back and let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, I know. I just wish it felt better." The memory of Blake's twisted grin as he was sentenced lingered in her mind long after the case was closed. Dallas was safer, yes, but she knew the shadow of his evil wouldn't fade so easily. Lessons from a horrific case. The Martin Blake case left wounds far deeper than those visible on the crime scenes. His capture and conviction might have brought some measure of justice to the families of his victims, but in the weeks and months that followed, the broader community in Dallas, and beyond, was left grappling with what his crimes truly meant. Inside the Dallas Police Department, the case wasn't just another entry in the files. It became a point of reflection, a haunting reminder of what could have been prevented, what systems failed, and what lessons needed to be learned. A conversation of accountability. Detectives Kate Monroe and Ray Sanders sat across from each other in the precinct bullpen one late night, the sound of the cleaning crew faintly echoing through the halls. The trial had been over for weeks, but the case lingered in their minds like an unwelcome shadow. "You ever feel like we missed something?" Kate asked suddenly. She was staring at a half-empty cup of coffee, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Ray leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "You mean during the case?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "Before it, like..." She hesitated, then went on. "How does a guy like Martin Blake go unnoticed for so long? How does someone escalate to that point without anyone stepping in and saying, 'Hey, this guy might be dangerous'?" Ray sighed, the words heavy on his breath. "You want the honest answer? 'Cause people don't want to see it, Kate. Even when the signs are right in front of them." She lifted her gaze to meet his. "You think someone saw it? Before us?" "Someone always sees it," Ray replied. He crossed his arms, his voice flattening. "Neighbors, co-workers, family, hell, maybe even teachers back when he was a kid. But people don't want to deal with that kind of thing. They look the other way. They say, 'Not my problem.' Or they don't know what they're looking at," Kate added quietly. Ray nodded. "Exactly. Most people wouldn't recognize the red flags unless they were waving right in front of their faces. A failure of systems." Martin Blake's background offered overwhelming clues to his eventual descent into madness. The records revealed a history of animal cruelty as a teenager, violent tendencies toward peers, and a brief stint in juvenile detention. Yet, every system meant to protect the community, from schools to family services to law enforcement, had failed to take significant steps. Chief Earl Carter held a private meeting with the lead detectives a few weeks after the trial, the conversation equal parts professional debriefing and soul-searching. "This case," he began, pacing the small conference room, "was a tornado. It came out of nowhere, it uprooted everything, and by the time it passed, it left us standing in the wreckage trying to make sense of it all." He stopped, locking eyes with Kate and Ray. "So I need to ask, what do we learn from this?" Kate glanced at Ray, then back at the chief. "I think it's about spotting patterns earlier, sir. Martin Blake didn't wake up one day and decide to start killing people. That kind of darkness builds over years. We need better systems to catch guys like him before they reach that breaking point." "And what do those systems look like?" Chief Carter pressed. "Let's be real here, Monroe. You know how many calls we get daily about neighbors acting strange or someone's kid being a little too violent? How do we separate the harmless from the dangerous?" Ray leaned forward, his hands clasped. "You can't flag every single weird guy in Dallas, but you can connect dots better. The schools knew he had problems when he was a kid. Social services had records on him. The juvie system? Same thing. But none of those alarms ever connected. It's not about spotting one red flag, it's about seeing the whole damn field of them." The chief sighed. "You're not wrong. But connecting all those dots before something like this happens, that's a whole other beast." The ripple effect. Beyond law enforcement, the case sparked conversations at every level of society. In schools, teachers grew more vigilant, behavioral programs were bolstered, and trainings were held to spot early signs of aggression, isolation, or obsession in students. At home, parents whispered anxiously over dinner tables, casting nervous eyes toward their children. "You know what I was thinking about today?" asked Lisa Garrett during a quiet dinner with her sister. Lisa, still recovering from the trauma of nearly being Blake's last victim, traced her finger along the rim of her glass of water. "What's that?" her sister asked gently. "His co-workers, his boss. Someone must have known, right? They saw something off about him and just didn't say anything." She paused, her eyes darkening. "What if someone had? Maybe Mallory, or Rachel, or Laura. Maybe they'd still be here." "Lisa, you can't put that on yourself." Her sister reached across the table, but Lisa shook her head. "It's not about blame," Lisa insisted. "It's about responsibility. If someone like that ever comes into my life, I'm never looking the other way. Not now. Not after this." Reconsidering the role of the community. In the weeks after Blake's sentencing, Dallas hosted several town hall meetings and public forums aimed at bringing the community together to process the case and plan for the future. At one such meeting, Pastor Ron Archer, a lifelong Dallas resident, stood up before a crowded room. "We can't put this all on the police," he said, his rich baritone voice carrying easily over the buzz of murmured agreement. "We, as a society, have responsibilities too. We see people unraveling, we see the warning signs, but we tend not to act until it's too late. That's gotta change, because if we keep waiting for someone else to step in, we'll just keep having more Martin Blakes in this world." Margaret Keegan, who was sitting quietly in the back row, folded her arms and leaned toward Kate. "He's not wrong," she muttered. "People think serial killers just appear out of nowhere, but they don't. They're built by years of neglect and missed signals. And by the time we're chasing them, it's already too late." Kate turned to her, her face serious. So how do we make it not too late? Keegan shrugged. Education, training, talking openly about stuff like this, even when it's uncomfortable, and maybe a little less mind your own business. A changed city. Months after Blake's conviction, the city of Dallas still bore scars from the horrors he inflicted, but it had also begun to change. Self-defense classes saw record enrollments, community watch programs were revitalized, and most importantly, at least for Kate and Ray, people seemed to care a little more about what happened in their own backyards. One afternoon, as Kate packed up her desk for the weekend, she glanced at Ray. "You think we made a difference?" He looked up from his paperwork, raising an eyebrow. "Catching him? Yeah, I'd say so." "No, I mean beyond that. You think we changed anything? Made people more aware?" Ray leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "All we can do is light the fire, Kate. Whether people keep it burning, that's up to them." With a small nod, Kate slung her bag over her shoulder. "Guess that's all we can hope for." As she walked out of the precinct, the low hum of a neighborhood watch report playing on a nearby radio made her pause and smile faintly. At least for now, people were paying attention. The Martin Blake case wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. For Dallas, for law enforcement, and for anyone who ever thought evil couldn't grow unnoticed in their midst. The lessons it left behind weren't easy, but they were necessary. Because while justice might have been served, the scars reminded everyone that vigilance wasn't just a duty, it was a responsibility. Kate didn't look up. "Just cleaning things up," she replied, though the stack of papers on her desk hadn't been touched. Ray pulled a chair out and plopped into it across from her. "Cleaning things up, huh? Looks to me like you're staring at the board like you're waiting for it to talk back." Kate smirked faintly but didn't take her eyes off the board. "It feels unfinished, Ray." "Unfinished? We caught him. Hell, we even got him to trial faster than most cases like this ever see the inside of a courtroom. What's left? Here's an expanded version of 12. Ket Thuk Nung Kong Cham Dut, The End But Not Over, written in a compelling American crime-style narrative with emotional insight and dialogue. The end, but not over. The gavel struck wood with finality. But for those who had lived through the terror of Martin Blake's crimes, the echoes of his twisted deeds were far from silenced. The case was over, or so the court had declared. Yet, for the families of the victims, the detectives who hunted Blake down, and the community that had lived under his reign of terror, the scars remained raw, the trauma unprocessed. In the weeks following the sentencing, the world outside moved on. Life in Dallas returned to an uneasy normal, but for those tied closely to the case, the shadow of Blake lingered, a reminder of how close evil often lurked. The family's struggles. Outside the precinct, Kate Monroe caught sight of Laura Bennett's sister Sarah, standing near her car after a victim advocate meeting. Sarah looked lost, her hand resting on the driver's door as if she had nowhere to go. Kate hesitated, then approached her. "I didn't think I'd see you here," Kate said gently, standing a few feet back. She knew these conversations rarely felt comforting but couldn't leave without saying something. Sarah looked up, her eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. "I thought coming here, talking about it, would feel better, but it doesn't." Kate nodded slowly. "It takes time. I keep thinking," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "Did she know? Did Laura know what was happening to her? Did she feel it, the fear, the pain? And then I think about—" She paused to compose herself, trembling as she spoke. "I think about what he said in court, that grin, that sick, awful grin." Kate stepped closer. "I can't tell you the things you don't want to know, and I won't unless you ask me. What I can tell you, Sarah, is that people like him, they're not as powerful as they make themselves out to be." He smiled to hide his fear. What scared him most wasn't the death sentence, it was losing the control. You took that from him, all of you. Sarah blinked hard, trying to hold herself together. "It still doesn't feel like it's enough. He took so much from us." "I know," Kate replied quietly. "It never does, but you're here. You're fighting back. That matters too." Conversations in the precinct inside the precinct bullpen that same evening, the mood remained heavy weeks after the trial. Kate sat at her desk, staring at her almost empty coffee cup as Ray Sanders plopped down across from her. "Still stuck on this one?" Ray asked, pulling the sugar packets she always ignored toward himself. "You're not?" Kate countered, a tired smirk on her lips as she leaned back in her chair. Ray shrugged. "I'm stuck on all of them, if I'm being honest. But yeah, this one's different. I keep thinking we should have seen it coming. Should have gotten to him sooner." Kate nodded. "Yeah, I've been replaying that part in my head too. The tannery, the patterns in his past, the people who crossed his path and ignored the warning signs. It all feels so obvious now. Ray stirred his coffee and gave a dry chuckle. Hindsight's a hell of a thing, isn't it? Do you think he was telling the truth? You know, in court, when he said, "You think it's over but it's not?" Kate's voice was steady but distant, her thoughts running deeper than the words betrayed. Ray leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk between them. Guys like him, they're all about the theatrics. They run on fear, that's their gasoline. He wanted people to feel like his shadow's still out there, even when he's rotting in a prison cell. He paused, then added, "But no. I don't think there's more coming, at least not from him." Kate tilted her head, skeptical. "You sound sure." "I'm not sure of much, but I know that prison walls suck the oxygen out of people like Martin Blake. The second he's locked away, he stops being who he was. No knives, no victims, no power, just another number in the system. That terrifies him more than anything." Lingering shadows. Not everyone shared Ray's confidence. Margaret Keegan, the FBI profiler who had assisted on the case, returned to Dallas briefly to collaborate on finishing the case files. She sat across from Kate that evening, the two of them poring over leftover crime scene photos and finalizing notes for the internal debriefings. Keegan held up a photo of the bloody utility blade found at the tannery, turning it slowly in her hands like it held some secret she'd missed. "He wasn't kidding about one thing," she said, breaking their silence. "Which is?" Kate asked without looking up. "Evil doesn't stop with one person, there's no finish line. You close one door and somewhere else another cracks open. People like Blake, he might be done. But his methods, the things he left behind..." She exhaled sharply. "That type of darkness doesn't stop just because you put one guy away." Kate sighed, pushing the folder in front of her aside. "So what, we just keep chasing shadows forever?" "That's the job." Keegan leaned back in her chair, gaze sharp but resigned. "But the fact that you're asking those questions means we're doing something right." A city moves on. Months passed. The public grew quieter about the crimes, returning to their everyday routines. But the legacy of the case had planted seeds that couldn't be uprooted. Downtown community centers began hosting free self-defense workshops, local schools implemented violence prevention programs, and Dallas PD launched an early warning task force to flag patterns of escalating behavior in at-risk individuals. On a humid summer morning, Kate and Ray found themselves at one of these community events, ostensibly there as representatives of the department, though neither was quite sure what to say in a room full of worried faces. A woman raised her hand, her knuckles white as she clasped a laminated photo of a young child. "What do we do?" the woman asked, "if we think someone we know, someone close to us, could hurt people like that?" Kate cleared her throat, stepping forward when no one else did. "You trust your instincts," she began, pacing slowly as she spoke. "You don't ignore the signs. You don't shrug it off or tell yourself it's not your problem. And you call us, or someone. There are places to turn, resources, people who will listen." She stopped, her eyes sweeping the tense faces in the room. "What you can't do is wait. Don't wait until it's too late." A private reckoning. That night, back at the station, Ray found Kate back at her desk, staring at the evidence board one last time. Most of the photos and documents had been removed, archived into case files, but a single strand of coarse brown hair, sealed in plastic, remained pinned at the center, like a symbol of everything they had faced and everything they never wanted to see again. "You never quit, do you?" Ray teased, leaning against the edge of her desk with his arms crossed. Kate gave a faint smile but didn't look at him. "Do you ever wonder if we hadn't caught him, how long he would have kept going?" "All the time," Ray admitted. "But we did, that's what counts." "Yeah," Kate murmured, "for now." Ray straightened up, his voice firm yet understanding. "For now is all we get, Kate. We stop what we can, when we can. And when it's not enough, we try harder next time." Kate finally looked up, meeting his tired but resolute gaze. "I just wish the endings felt like endings, you know? Like something was really finished." Ray gave her a faint, knowing smile. "They never are. That's why it's called the job." The persistence of memory. The Martin Blake case had long since been closed, but for those who lived it, it was never truly over. His name might have faded from headlines, his crimes relegated to archival footage and training manuals, but the lesson remained embedded in the fabric of Dallas. In the quiet of the precinct or the restless nights haunted by what could have been, one truth lingered: evil didn't end when the court pronounced its sentence. It shifted, adapted, and waited. Kate and Ray knew this better than most. As Kate stood in the parking lot that evening, the warm glow of the city on the horizon, she took a deep breath. Somewhere out there was another storm waiting to brew, but for now, the sky was clear.